Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Hartman, and I'm Director of Education for Bard on the Beach. In an ordinary summer, Bard on the Beach is a Shakespeare Festival, performing 4 plays for about 100,000 patrons in a truly magnificent place called Snock. On the waterfront, in the heart of what we now call Vancouver, Snock has a rich, vibrant, and very long history as a place of gathering and storytelling. Right now, of course, we can only gather in a virtual space, but we are still gathering, which is a powerful thing. And each of us is zooming in from somewhere. So I invite you all to take a moment, wherever you are, to appreciate the place where you are, to appreciate the history, culture, and spirit of that place and your connection to it. We at Bard on the Beach are on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the sponsors of Bard's 2021 season, the Peter and Joanne Brown Foundation and BMO. And I'd also like to thank the sponsor of the Bard Explored series, the Office of the President of Simon Fraser University. It's a difficult day in a difficult year. And I am grateful that we can find ways of connecting with one another, asking questions together, and sharing ideas and insights. I imagine some of you joining us are new to Bard Explored, and to you, I say welcome. And I imagine some of you have been committed regulars to our series, and to you, I say thank you. Those who've attended Bard Explored before, you know how brilliant Dr. Paul Boudre is. And for those who are new, I'm excited to introduce you to him. Paul is professor of English at Simon Fraser University, where he teaches Shakespeare and early modern literature. He has served as chair of the English department and associate dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. And he's currently director of SFU Publications. Paul has won awards for teaching and has an impressive list of publications on both Renaissance literature and popular culture. And our Bard Explored patrons will certainly know what an engaging, inspiring speaker he is, sharing knowledge and offering insights with extraordinary wit and flair. Paul and I started working together on Bard Explored series in 2009 because we realized that the patrons of our Shakespeare Festival were inquisitive, engaged, and eager to learn more about the plays they loved. Our series of Saturday morning talks drew committed regulars while welcoming newcomers to fulfill our central mission at Bard Education, inspiring community. I can't wait till we can all gather in person again. In the meantime, I'm grateful for this. I'll be back at the end to help with the Q&A, but now I'd like to turn it over to you, Paul, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I too can't wait to get back into the tents and to see all the regulars and make new friends, people excited about Shakespeare. But today, I have the very great privilege of being able to introduce you to Professor Emma Smith, one of England's or perhaps one of the world's preeminent Shakespeare scholars. Emma Smith did her undergraduate degree at Somerville College, Oxford. And she was a prize fellow at Souls College, Oxford, and she is now Professor of Shakespeare Studies at the University of Oxford, which has to be one of the best Shakespeare jobs in the world, as well as being a fellow of Hertford College. Now, we only have this morning about 45 minutes, so I won't be able to list all of her publications. I'll just mention a few of them from the past few years. There was the Making of Shakespeare's First Folio, which was published in 2015. Shakespeare's First Folio, 4 Centuries of an Iconic Book, published in 2016. And recently, the book This is Shakespeare, published by Pelican in 2019, has become a Sunday Times bestseller and has been translated into several languages. It's received glowing reviews in publications like The Guardian. Professor Smith is also the editor of the Cambridge University Press journal, Shakespeare Survey. Now, much of her scholarly work has revolved around the original printing of Shakespeare's plays, especially the First Folio, and we'll talk about that later, but her work has taken her outside of the Academy. She has worked with theater companies, including the Royal Shakespeare Company. She was a script advisor on Josie Rourke's 2018 film, Mary, Queen of Scots. And many of her lectures from Oxford have been turned into podcasts, the Approaching Shakespeare podcast and the Not Shakespeare, Elizabethan and Jacobean Popular Theatre podcast. And these lectures are models of scholarly clarity. I can't recommend them enough. So Emma, welcome to Bard on the Beach.
It's an enormous pleasure to be here, and just echoing what Mary was saying. I mean, this is something that wouldn't actually be possible if we were all in the tents. And I know you're all keen to get back to normal, but for me, it's great to be doing this. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's wonderful to have you here. So I'd like to start with a question that I'm going to be posing to all the guests in this series. As you know, Bard on the Beach produced a film called Done Undone, written by Kate Besworth, that explored a number of big questions around Shakespeare, especially Shakespeare now, Shakespeare in the theater today. And perhaps the overarching question of the film is Shakespeare still relevant? Should we still be performing the plays of the archetypal dead white male some 450 years after his heyday, and playing them so often, some people would argue, to the detriment of other playwrights, old and contemporary? And if we do perform them, how should we perform them? So a very broad question, but let's just start with some big ideas.
It's a really important question, and that film, I think, addresses the question with wit and with intelligence and with a sense of nuance. It's a really, really great film. I really recommend it. You can watch it online via the website, and I really encourage people to do that, because I think it sets out in a playful way, by which I mean a sort of theatrical way, as well as the fun, with a sense of fun, what these questions are. And sometimes they're questions, aren't they, which become very, very fraught or very adversarial. So there is a small part of me, let's get this out of the way first, which thinks actually we perhaps do overperform Shakespeare, and that there are some slots taken up in Shakespeare, in certain sort of theatrical worlds by Shakespeare, which might be opened up. Having said that, though, there are other things I would take off the London theatre scene. The Mousetrap is one of them. And in fact, I've set it as one of my aims to get this off by telling everybody who did it. It's an Agatha Christie crime, and it was the policeman. So don't go. Let's close it down. We can have something fun in that theatre instead. It's been going for 50 years. So I mean, there is... One of the things that are about the overperformance, perhaps, of Shakespeare is that I think it does allow us to be a bit more... could allow us, and sometimes does allow us, to be a bit more playful and a bit more radical and a bit more experimental with these plays. We're not doing the one, full dress production of X play that there will be in our lifetime. We're doing one amid lots of others, and it kind of doesn't have to be definitive. It can be within that whole spectrum of other productions, and I think that is one way that Shakespeare's prominence in the repertory, both in your country and in mine, can open up the plays to be sort of more interesting and more unsettling again. And it's certainly true in the UK, and I get the sense from particularly from the film that Shakespeare has been the place where the classical theatre in the UK has really explored questions of diversity in casting and more actively sort of political and topical resonances in some really interesting ways. So I do feel that Shakespeare sometimes is the problem, but I also think Shakespeare gives us the resources to sort of think about the problem, or to just as Shakespeare was exported by the Brits to its colonies, then it was sort of brought back, written back. The Empire wrote back in some really fascinating and interesting ways. So, Shakespeare looks like as you say, the archetypal dead white male. And his plays, I think, give us a huge resource for sort of thinking with that, thinking against that. So, of course, Shakespeare is the thing that probably one of the things that makes me tick. I'm not going to say that we should get rid of it.
Well,
No way.
we're not going to, we both have careers, so no, we don't want to get rid of this. What do you, I mean, I guess one of the things that a lot of directors and playgoers face is, what do we do with those parts of Shakespeare that are, terribly sexist, terribly racist? Should we contextualize them? Should we alter them in performance, which I see more and more? What's your opinion about that?
Well, I am not a purist about Shakespeare's text, even though I'm very interested in the details of how we got it. Mm-hmm. So I'm perfectly happy for directors to change the text, to cut it. I think cutting is an important part of directing. I think most Shakespeare plays are really a bit too long for modern audiences. And I'm happy for people to cut for reasons, for reasons other than length. I don't think that we in some way owe it to Shakespeare's plays to deliver every word for whatever reason. So I think sometimes cutting can be the most appropriate thing to do. I think, for example, a phrase like "to wash the Ethiop white," which we get in Shakespeare, it's not actually particularly meaningful. It doesn't particularly do anything for those speeches. I think unless you want it to resonate a bit more with a more and surface a kind of racial dialogue. If you don't want to do that, I would just cut that phrase. I don't think it adds anything at all. On the other hand, I do think that Shakespeare's plays can enable some quite difficult issues to be looked at in the round. I think it would be too simplistic to say, for example, of The Merchant of Venice, that it is anti-Semitic. I think it can be presented in an anti-Semitic way, and it has a long history of anti-Semitic appropriations. But I also think it's a play that you can turn around and use to think in a much more sympathetic and more engaged way about the place of Shylock the Jew in Venice, and in the Venice of Shakespeare's play, and in other contexts since. So I suppose that sounds a bit like a sort of on the fence answer. The thing is, I think cutting is fine. I don't think we have an obligation to do Shakespeare in full. But I also think, and I think if we want to if we want to engage with The Taming of the Shrew, or we want to engage with Merchant of Venice or Othello, plays which have some very problematic elements for the 21st century, we've got to do that in a wholehearted way. We can't shirk those questions. And if that's what the production wants to be about, then great. That's a good, brave thing.
You, in some of your own work, you find resonances in Shakespeare with contemporary social issues, and you're not afraid to draw upon popular culture in your references. And can you talk about any specific resonances that you think are sort of helpful resonances between Shakespeare and, say, contemporary popular culture or social conditions that help tease out ideas in Shakespeare? Perhaps you do this with your students.
There are a couple of examples that come to mind. One is about how ways of thinking in the 21st century open up things that we never saw before in Shakespeare's works. And I'm just working on Twelfth Night, wonderful late comedy by Shakespeare, very often called bittersweet. It's a sort of end of the festivities feel about it. And at the heart of Twelfth Night is Viola, this character who dresses in male clothing as Cesario, and is this object of desire both for Olivia, who is in mourning, and for Orsino, who thinks he's in love with Olivia. And it's from working on this with my students, we've always seen Twelfth Night, I think, in the light of the gender politics of the time. My students have helped me to see that there are some really interesting ways to understand Viola through some of the narratives about trans experience. So that's to say, we don't really say, well, why does Viola, why does she dress in male clothing? It's quite undermotivated in lots of ways. Or why doesn't she come back in women's clothing at the end? Why does nobody call her Viola? Why do we assume that Orsino doesn't know what, and increasingly the pronoun that comes, that we've learnt to think about, the pronoun they, comes much more readily to mind. So that's a way that Twelfth Night looks to me, because of the context of working with my students in 2021, which it didn't look like even 10 or 20 years ago, and it may not look like in 10 or 20 years' time. And on the point about how pop culture can help Shakespeare, help us understand Shakespeare, there's lots of things I really enjoy about those kinds of comparisons. One of the ways I try and help students, and I think myself, about the history plays that Shakespeare wrote as a sequence is to map them onto George Lucas's Star Wars, which is, that there is a sort of there's a really successful trilogy which gets to a kind of narrative endpoint. So the only thing to do is to excavate the prehistory. And that's exactly what Shakespeare does by writing the Henry VI plays and Richard III, and then thinking, oh, this is a winning kind of combination, this is a winning formula. And what I'm going to have to do is to go back to, and it's as if they had all been reassessed, this is now episode 1 and episode 2. It's,
I have used that analogy too for years. Got to get to the students somehow and explain this stuff. So that's very interesting. Now, I just want to quote something you said in one of your lectures. This is your confession. I don't really care what he might have meant, and nor should you.
Yeah, I absolutely. I stand by that, really. I don't think our obligation to Shakespeare, to use that phrase again, is to, for me, it's not to step back in time. So I'm not primarily a historian. And I think that if and when Shakespeare is meaningful to us, it's because something, as we've just been talking about, resonates with us now. And my sense is that we should absolutely go with that, rather than trying to check it against what we think Shakespeare intended. A, because we can't know, and because Shakespeare, even more so than his fellow playwrights, seems to have had no interest in the kind of framing materials that might help us with some sense of his own artistic philosophy. Someone like Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's kind of rival and fellow, is writing prefatory material and letters and bits and pieces, just giving a kind of sense of a kind of aesthetic theory or something around these wonderful comedies that he writes. And Shakespeare could have done that and doesn't do it. So I think Shakespeare's probably not too bothered. He's allowing the plays to stand on their own. We can't know what he intended, but also, even if we could, I don't think it would matter. I had an interview once, and somebody said to me, what would you, if you could meet Shakespeare, what would you ask him? And I was completely flummoxed about that, because I realized I didn't really want to know. There was nothing I wanted to know from Shakespeare the man, in a way. Well, of course, there's everything you would want to know, but that wouldn't answer for me questions about the plays. They're not, to me, the most interesting questions.
Now I'm stuck saying, what would I ask him? I don't even know where to start.
No.
Good. No, that's amazing. But I take your point. I think it's really well made, that the notion of sort of authorial intention is something we sort of have to put to the side, throw out the window. On the other hand, doesn't that sort of conflict with the title of your book, This is Shakespeare, which suggests a certain sort of certainty? Here's the answer.
Yeah. And so, in a way, the answer is, there isn't an answer, or the answer is, what I say in the book is Shakespeare is full of gaps, is full of holes, is actually incomplete. And, actors and theatre makers have known this forever. They know, as soon as we talk about Shakespeare's plays as scripts, which is pretty much what they are, we immediately understand that they are not the whole thing. A script is instructions for performance, or something. It needs other things to be fully realized. And I think even if we're not thinking about performing Shakespeare, the sense that these are not complete works, these are not brilliant, hermetically sealed, finalized poems, but they are sort of dynamic interventions that need us to make sense of them. They need theatre makers, they need readers, they need actors and creative people to engage with them. That seems to me that's what Shakespeare is, in some ways, a resource or a set of texts that require our input.
Well, you in a couple of places you talk about the inconsistencies and flaws in Shakespeare's writing, and I just quote you again: the sheer and permissive gappiness in his drama. What are your favorite gaps?
So, I think gappiness is fundamental to Shakespeare's drama pretty much at every level. So one of the things, if we think about Shakespeare as a script writer, or Shakespeare's works as scripts, Shakespeare's dramatic works as scripts, one of the gaps is stage directions, mostly. So if you read your modern or the edition you had at school or something, you will see stage directions that have been put in by editors to help readers understand what's happening, or to kind of shape their the sense of the absent stage, if you like. I know from working in rehearsal rooms that most directors get rid of stage directions straight away and sort of get the dialogue up and see, what do we feel people need to be doing, and how does this work? So those stage directions tend not to be actually used in the theatre, but it's very, very interesting when they are not there so often. One really good example, I think, is at the end of The Taming of the Shrew. Catherine, who is the shrew of the title, has possibly been tamed by her husband Petruchio. It's really difficult to know. She's been a kind of it's impossible to summarize the kind of gender politics of this play, but in case you don't know it, at the end of the play, Petruchio says, "I'll show you how well-behaved Catherine now is. If I call her, she'll come." And so he has a bet with his male friends. And not only does Catherine come, she delivers this great long speech about how women ought to obey their husbands. I mean, it's such a long speech that you think it sort of must make everybody feel a bit uncomfortable, or maybe it's a bit over the top. But at the end, she says to wives, you should be ready to put your hand beneath your husband's foot, and my hand is ready, may it do him ease. And there's no stage direction, so we don't know whether Catherine really does do, lowers herself, perhaps bobs down to the stage to say, stand on my hand. That's how loyal I am to you. Or whether she sort of stands, with her arms folded, saying, "Go on, make me." And then, the most famous line probably in the play, thanks to Cole Porter, Petruchio says, "Why, there's a wench, come on and kiss me, Kate." And again, no stage direction. Now, if you can, reach down from the people who are here with us this morning, if you can reach down the Shakespeare book you've got, I'm guessing your editor will have put a stage direction in there to say they kiss, or he kisses her, or something. Well, maybe, or maybe not.
And of course, the other big one, which in my experience has baffled directors, is what to do at the end of Measure for Measure with Isabella and the Duke. When the Duke says, "Oh, we're going to get married," does Isabella fling herself into his arms or recoil in horror? And I've seen it performed a variety of ways.
Yes, absolutely. It's more difficult now, isn't it? In some ways, the more edgy version of that now is to have her agree to the marriage. Yeah. I think it's certainly that's been less common in recent productions. Yeah, and of course, it's the work of a minute to write a line of acceptance for her. If you want to know about intention, it seems to me it is intended that ending is open.
Yeah, I understand you're also working on something called 30 Myths About Shakespeare.
Yeah, actually, that's out. 30
Oh, it's
Myths
out.
About Shakespeare is out. Yeah, yeah.
Give us a favorite myth.
Oh, that's a good question. What about, well, I hardly dare mention it because it sort of annoys everybody. But in some ways, the Uber myth is, Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. That's the one that always comes back, and that lots of highly intelligent and highly detailed work by people is done on other contenders for this. And one of the things I wrote this book, 30 Great Myths About Shakespeare, with my colleague Laurie Maguire, and in a way we wanted to understand why these myths about Shakespeare have been so, why they've lasted so long, or why they've been so important. So for example, one of the myths we talk about is, Shakespeare hated his wife. Shakespeare had an unhappy marriage. The evidence we've got for that is the will, where he leaves her his second best bed. There's been a huge amount of effort trying to make out that the second best bed was the marital bed, and that's a great sort of gift. It's very hard to judge quite what that might have meant. But we also were interested in a kind of cliche of the brilliant, gifted man who sort of almost by definition, that man cannot have a wife who understands and loves and supports him. It doesn't go with that cliche. He has to be a bit, withdrawn. He doesn't have a normal family life. Can't have people close to him. That's something we would be interested in, that as something which spreads sort of beyond Shakespeare into something about the stories, the way narratives about biography work.
Even the Shakespeare is the brooding romantic poet in his garret, channeling the gods and putting out these perfect play poems.
Yes,
it's a really romantic notion of authorship, which I
completely.
And some time ago,
I completely agree. I completely agree, Paul. That's really important in it. And also, I must say, a slightly sexist sense that a man who marries a pregnant wife must have been trapped into marriage. We know that Anne Hathaway was almost certainly pregnant when they married, because Susanna is born 6 months later. But that it's very hard to judge what that might have meant. But there has been a tendency for mostly, I think, male sort of biographers to feel that this must have been terrible for Shakespeare. Setting aside, I don't really like to read the works biographically, but if you wanted to, you would say the comedies are full of sort of young, inexperienced men being sort of tutored and directed and managed by stronger, very desirable women. That's what Shakespeare's comedies are about. You'd much rather be Rosalind, wouldn't you, than Orlando in As You Like.
Yeah. And of course, there was
Rosalind stage managing that whole thing.
There was that recent novel about Anne Hathaway, presenting her as sort of this wise woman, sort of almost magical woman, and making her so strong and making their relationship so intense. It was just a real sort of nice tonic to that tradition.
Yeah, completely. Maggie Farrell's Hamnet. Yeah, brilliant novel. I really recommend that. Really an extraordinary evocation of what Stratford life would have been like. The best I've ever read of all the histories and everything that I've read about it.
I agree. Now, one of the great innovations in Shakespeare studies since I've been studying Shakespeare, or been teaching for the past 30 years or so, is our increasing recognition of how often Shakespeare had collaborators, which is something that certainly when I was an undergraduate, even in graduate school, no one ever talked about that. But now we recognize this more and more. And Emma, you have argued that Shakespeare's play All's Well That Ends Well was written in collaboration with the playwright Thomas Middleton, although for centuries it had been solely attributed to Shakespeare. And I think part of that sole attribution thing, again, goes back to this romantic notion of authorship, the sole author churning things out. So couple of questions. First of all, what made you first think the play might be a collaboration? And then how do you go about proving that? I think a lot of people are sort of find this process very mysterious.
I mean, I find it slightly mysterious too. So authorship studies, one of the I agree that this is something that has really changed over the last 2 or 3 decades. And what's also changed about the methodology for thinking about authorship is it has become very quantitative, aided by computer searches of different sorts. And the sense of what kind of variation is statistically significant and those things, that's become a very, very technical business. And that's not something that I have any expertise in. And I'm afraid to say, and it may sound, I'm not particularly interested in that either. What made, I had been working on Thomas Middleton, Shakespeare's younger collaborator, and also a playwright who seems to have perhaps done a kind of buff up, a kind of a shining over plays when they were revived after Shakespeare's death. So if a play was going to be put on again, somebody would look over the script, I think, take out anything that was obviously outdated, maybe think about the new actor who was going to play this role and how they would do it, and maybe add in some other bits and pieces that would make it not seem old. I think people who went to the theatre in the 1600s wanted to see new work. They didn't really want to see old-fashioned stuff, apart from a few great sort of favourites.
Spanish tragedy.
Spanish tragedy. In fact, everybody wanted to see the Spanish tragedy. So I've been thinking about Middleton, and one of the things about Middleton's work is that he writes, we already just mentioned stage directions. Middleton writes very, very detailed stage directions that are often, in part, a summary of what's happened. So, for example, he will write a stage direction which says, in come X and Y from the prison where they have left their prisoner. So that, I mean, you could never really enter conveying all that information. But it's a written thing, which is partly a kind of continuity piece, I think, to say, this is where we're up to, and this is where we last saw these people. Whether it's meant for readers, whether it's meant for Middleton himself as he's writing, I don't know. Anyway, there's one of those in All's Well. And I was looking at it and thinking, this is very, very unlike, Shakespeare. This is not a Shakespearean stage direction. And it started from there. And then, there's been a lot of work on Middleton's style, which is has some syntactic differences from Shakespeare's. One of the things that's most interesting, I think, about that is we tend to think of Shakespeare as a very modern writer, and because we are so invested in him, we think of him anticipating all kinds of things about modern life. But in fact, Shakespeare's use of language in certain ways is quite old-fashioned, and he's a provincial boy. He's not a Londoner, and he would routinely use a verb form, which would be something like, I did go. Whereas a Londoner, few years younger, like Thomas Middleton, would routinely use the form, I went.
Right.
So those kinds of elements are ways that you can see, possibly see a difference between the writers. So it was all done by a kind of, none of it was done by computer or by these kinds of methods. And it was, there were lots of mistakes in the analysis, but I'm very pleased that the new Oxford Shakespeare, which is a big edition come out from Oxford University Press, edited by Terry Boras and Gary Taylor, they have done a huge amount of that kind of quantitative work, and they have corroborated the idea of Middleton, not as a collaborator in a sort of what we call a synchronous collaborator, so not somebody who's writing in a kind of writing room situation, but someone who has done that kind of pass through the text later with his own sense of what he wants to highlight.
Well, great. And Gary Taylor, of course, the big Middleton expert.
Sure, absolutely.
Gary agrees, absolutely. Now, I have to ask you something a little bit different, which I think our listeners will be fascinated by. The first folio of Shakespeare, published 7 years after his death in 1623 by his friends, and gives half the plays of Shakespeare are only found in the folio, so one of the most important books in the Western tradition. And there's about 235 copies of the first folio around. And then in April of 2016, it was announced that another copy had been found in the Bute collection, a collection of books and artifacts in this big Gothic mansion on the island of Bute in Scotland. And Emma, you were called in to authenticate that copy. Now, two questions. First of all, what is the process for that? And then secondly, what does it feel like to uncover a new folio?
Well, let's take the second one first. I mean, this was a absolutely once in a lifetime experience. I had been told by a colleague in my university whose job was to make connections between academics and heritage sort of museums. And he was trying to make a connection between academics and Mount Stuart House, which was the house of the Marquesses of Bute on the island of Bute, just off the west coast of Scotland. And he persuaded me to go on a trip to look at their library. And he persuaded me by saying, nobody's really looked at it in modern times. And rumor has it that they have a first folio of Shakespeare that no one's ever seen. So I said, oh yeah, okay, I'll go. That sounds a good, fun gig. But I am absolutely sure, you know, I'm really prepared to put quite a big bet on it that they don't have a first folio of Shakespeare. This is, as you said, one of the most important books in the Western tradition. It's one of the most studied books. That's why we know we've got all these copies. And it's been studied, you know, since the end of the 19th century. It's really difficult to think this one sort of got away and has never been looked at. So he said, oh, well, we'll see. So I went to Bute, and I fully expected to see a facsimile copy of the first folio, which were very popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they were published with a sort of removable title page, which gave the information that said, this has been published in 1903 or 1908. And then you could take that out. And to all intents and purposes, you had a sort of photographic facsimile of a first folio. And I thought, this is what they'll have. And, you know, it's going to be a bit uncomfortable to be the hoity-toity one coming in on the ferry from Oxford and saying, haha, you know, you think you've got a first folio. Anyway, that's completely wrong. The first thing I thought was when, so I said, what's Shakespeare? I went to this great library, not like a public library or like a sort of gentleman's library, you know, a library room. And I said, you know, hey, what's the Shakespeare that you've got? And they got out loads of leather-bound volumes, which were all 18th and 19th century ones, exactly the things a gentleman's library would have. And I thought, yeah, this is just what I expected. And I actually thought, maybe, I'm quite a keen naturalist, maybe I will see an otter on Bute, and this won't have been a wasted trip. I will see an otter, which I've long wanted to see. This will be amazing. Anyway, then they brought out this box, which was folio-sized, and the book was in 3 volumes, and that made me think, oh, that's quite strange, because a 19th century copy would never have been in 3 volumes because you didn't want that. And I opened the first volume, and as I'm telling you, I can feel that now, actually, that the hair's going up on the back of my neck, because I saw an inscription in the first volume from someone called Isaac Reed, who was someone I knew about as an 18th century editor. He was in the shadow of the big fish at that time, who were, you know, Samuel Johnson and Alexander Pope, and, you know, 18th century is big, exciting time for editing. And I knew that Isaac Reed was supposed to have had a copy of Shakespeare's first folio, and that we didn't know where it was. And I saw this inscription which said how he had come by it, that had been given, bequeathed to him. And that made me think, okay, that would be a very weird thing to to pretend. You know, I can't imagine anybody who was going to make a kind of facsimile or a fake. I mean, some facsimiles were fakes; they were designed to mislead. I can't think anybody would bother to do it with this sort of no-mark 18th century person's name, Isaac Reed. And as I turned through the pages, I suppose I had looked by that point at about 120 copies of the first folio. And I thought, but I'd never looked at one which wasn't already presented to me as a confirmed first folio. And I thought, yeah, this looks right to me in all kinds of ways. But what I needed to do was to go back. So I went back in the January of 2016. It was very, very, very cold. And I went back with a proper light that you can use to look for watermarks, a list of all the known paper watermarks from the folio, the list of the, all this very specific corrections, misprints, those kinds of glitches that you can use. And I went through, every page and checked that. And really the watermarks, the paper watermarks, are almost impossible to fake, particularly at that length. So bit by bit, that my instinct when I saw it that it was a real one, turned out to be provable. But it was a hugely exciting, extraordinarily exciting time.
And where's that copy now?
It's still there. It's still on the Isle of Bute. And in fact, it was very funny that the story as it came out was, it was all about how extraordinary that it should be found on this far away, remote island of Bute. And in fact, Mount Stuart House and the tourist office in Bute were trying to say it's actually surprisingly accessible. Come and see. Because we did want people to go and see the other treasures of Mount Stuart House, which is an extraordinary. If a hugely wealthy family had downsized all their castles and palaces into this one Gothic pile, that would be Mount Stuart House. It's an extraordinary place.
Wow, that's an amazing story. We're probably going to get questions in a few minutes, but I just have one last little one for you. Your Twitter handle is Old Fortunatus, which is the title of a highly allegorical play by Thomas Becker. Why that name? And what's the appeal of
That's
that
really
play?
just a mistake, Paul, actually. That was my misunderstanding of how Twitter worked when I started it. And I thought you had to have some sort of cryptic-ish handle. And I was teaching that play at the time. And I was teaching it as the kind of the sort of fantasy version of, along with Dr. Faustus, of how you might use the theatre to travel to new worlds. And in Decker's play, Old Fortunatus has a wishing hat and sort of moves around the world with that. It used to be a really famous play. Do you know it's in Marx uses it as a sort of idea, as a throwaway comparison about sort of free money. It must have been sufficiently known as a story in the 19th century, which I was very surprised at. Anyway, so I think it was a bit of a mistake, and I should have had a sensible Twitter handle, which would have been Emma Smith or something.
Something like that.
But I didn't, and now I'm stuck with it.
It's still pretty cool. While we're waiting for the questions to come in, my favorite sort of Shakespeare gap or flaw, perhaps you know this one already, the mystery of Hamlet's Irish friend. You know that one? When Hamlet's when Hamlet sneaks up behind Claudius, Claudius is at prayer, and he says, "Now might I do it, Pat?" I know.
Very good. Very good. Very good. As if Hamlet doesn't have enough characters already.
As if Hamlet doesn't have enough characters already. I don't know. Are we ready for questions now, Mary?
Sure. Doug and Margaret would like to know, or they said, Dr. Smith's observation that the frequency of Shakespearean productions affords directors and companies a certain freedom of interpretation resonated. Is it similar to the great or merely good show tunes, which become jazz standards, so familiar to an audience that they can understand the improvisation?
Doug and Margaret, that's a lovely, lovely question. And I think there are so many ways in which the sort of improvisatory energy of jazz is a good analogy for Shakespeare that I'm really, really pleased that you have mentioned it. And you're absolutely right that it's partly about familiarity, I think, and that what you then enjoy is the expectation of the chord or the change in the rhythm, but also an appreciation of how it's being done slightly differently. And I guess if you're a jazz aficionado or a Shakespeare aficionado, you probably have your own kind of elasticity about how far you think it can go before it needs to come back to the standard, you know, how far that improvisation can go. But I think it's a splendid thing to bring up. But also, of course, I mean, there've been some brilliant jazz Shakespeare, haven't there? You know, I'm thinking about Duke Ellington's Such Sweet Thunder. Cleo Lane and Johnny Dankworth did an amazing jazz album of Shakespeare songs, which I can't now remember the title of, I'm afraid. But you know, lots and lots and lots of examples. So I think there is a real affinity. I'm really pleased you asked that. Thank you.
Michelle would like your opinion on some of the best but seldom performed plays.
Well, that fits really well, Michelle, with what Dr. Margaret just asked, doesn't it? Because, you know, one pleasure is seeing something or hearing something in their version that you know well, and what you can appreciate is what's been done differently, and you've got that balance of familiarity and novelty. But the other best pleasure about going to the theatre is going to something where you don't know quite how it's going to work out, or you're not comparing it in your mind with a different production. You're seeing it for the first time. So I think going to see something that you haven't seen before is always just great fun. And the first time you see, I don't know, Two Gentlemen of Verona or something, or Comedy of Errors or something. Comedy of Errors is a big favourite of mine. A sort of slapsticky play with two sets of twins. Basically, the plot of Comedy of Errors is whichever twin you think it is, it's actually the other one. That's all you need to know about the plot. But it's got some quite sort of dark psychological aspects to it too. So I actually, with the plays that tend to be least performed are the ones we tend to think of as early. So Two Gentlemen of Verona, Comedy of Errors, the Henry VI plays, they're all probably from the first 2 or 3 years of Shakespeare's career. And so I would always encourage you to go and have a look at those if you get the chance to.
I would throw in Henry VIII too, which I think is the only Shakespeare play I have never seen performed. Henry VIII.
Well, Bard on the Beach. What about that? What about that?
Yeah.
Michelle would also like to know, have the sonnets ever been performed?
Well, I have never been. I wonder what Paul thinks. I'm also sorry. I can see I'm descending into a kind of gloom. It's just coming up to 8 p.m. in the UK. So I'm sorry. I seem to be receding into the shadows a bit. I don't want to get up and put my light on. I've never seen the sonnets performed as a live piece. I've seen there's a wonderful YouTube channel from the Royal Shakespeare Company that they did during lockdown, which was their actors reading a sonnet, different sonnet every day. So there are lots of examples of the sonnets being read and given a kind of dramatic intonation. Derek Jarman's very experimental film Blue used the sonnets quite extensively. But I don't know of a performance. What about anyone else on this call? Paul, Mary?
I don't know. Theatrical. There have been a number of musical performances. And the names of the artists right now are slipping my mind, but there's that young, no, not young anymore, pianist. It's totally gone from my mind. Who set a bunch of them to music, and also the guitarist from Pink Floyd recorded one of them. Did a beautiful recording of them, but I don't know that I've ever seen them made into a theatrical performance either.
Okay, so but Dean did see Simon Callow directed by Michael Langham at the Stratford Festival. Amazing. I've heard Simon Callow reading the sonnets, but I haven't seen something that's more performance-y. Yeah, thank you.
A question from an anonymous attendee is, did Shakespeare really write King Lear during pandemic lockdown?
Well, what an interesting question that turned out to be. So basically, plague, bubonic plague, this isn't very comforting in a way, but bubonic plague was endemic in the London population throughout Shakespeare's writing career. And from the period of about 1603 to about 1609, every summer, so plague was a much worse disease in summertime, every summer the theatres underwent some period of closure because of the plague statistics. So the theatres were closed if the plague deaths exceeded 30 a week. So some of the things we have become used to about, watching a dashboard of statistics was not completely unknown, particularly to theatre practitioners in the early modern period. So that means it's quite likely that Shakespeare would have written King Lear, possibly while the theatres were closed, probably in 1606. But I don't think it's the most interesting of the plays that has a plague connection. Shakespeare's plays use, and I think it's one of the things we've become much more conscious of in the last 18 months, the language of plague and infection and the cursing of people with infection, which perhaps seemed to us not a very, we just kind of glossed over it. I think those curses have come into relief, or those descriptions come into relief much more. And King Lear is full of those. Lear calls his daughter an embossed carbuncle, that's to say a plague sore. I mean, it's a disgusting and a terrifying thing to say, and I think we're more conscious of that now perhaps than we were. But a play that we already mentioned, that Paul mentioned because of its ambiguous ending, Measure for Measure. I think Measure for Measure was definitely written during a lockdown, a big, very extended period of plague, theatre closure and high plague deaths, which sort of straddled the very, very end of Elizabeth's reign in 1603 and the coming of King James to London, and James's eventual public accession to the throne in 1604. Mm-hmm. And I think Measure for Measure, which is a play very much about plague, although the plague is a plague of sort of morality or a plague of venereal disease or something, it looks really, really interesting now to me in ways that that I didn't see before. It seems to me that in part it's about some people in a society beset by plague who respond by shutting themselves away and denying human contact. And some people who respond to that same situation by sort of seizing the day and embracing human contact. And that's partly what's going on in Measure for Measure. It's partly what's going on in Oxford as well, as we prepare to come back for the new academic year. But I think that question of Shakespeare's plague works just has become so fascinating. It's a really good example of how Shakespeare's works have got meanings for us that we don't tend to see until our own world changes, and that reveals something, that shines a light on something that we'd overlooked previously. So I guess that's the thing that excites me about Shakespeare. These are works in motion; they're always moving, and that's just kind of wonderful about them.
Wonderful. And I want to explain our special surprise guest here. This is Christopher Gaze, our artistic director, who also founded Bard on the Beach in 1990. Is that correct, Christopher? And we're just delighted to turn on his camera so he could say hello.
Honored to meet you, Christopher. Thank you so much.
Oh gosh, what a pleasure. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
And hear you.
Oh, good, good. Yeah, it's just I've loved this this time together, and I don't mean to stop it, but I just want to say thank you so much. And one day I hope to wander the streets of Oxford, Sine Plague, and take you for.
Yeah, look me up. That would be great. That would be great.
Yeah.
I'll even put the lights on.
I'm afraid we're at our time for today, so I will have to draw things to a close. Thank you for your surprise visit, Christopher. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Emma. This has been such a treat. Thank you, Ava. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, everyone who was able to attend. We have 2 more of these coming up. And so please join us. Go to our website, bardonthebeach.org, where you can find all the details for Bard Explored. We'll have Farah Kareem Cooper from Shakespeare's Globe in London, and we'll also have Paul Yakton from McGill University in Montreal. And while you're there, please, oh please, if you have not yet seen Done Undone, you can buy your ticket there for an on-demand experience of that film. Again, thank you all so much. And until next time, farewell.